Hi, and welcome to our webinar, Indoors or Outdoors, What's Right for Your Pet Bird. We will be starting the webinar shortly with Dr. Stephanie Lamb. And in the meantime, I'm going to launch a very relevant to the topic poll. Let's see how this goes. I'm going to launch the poll. Basically, it is, does your bird spend time outdoors? So if you are on with this already, go ahead and let's see what your answers are. So does your bird spend time outdoors? Yes, in an outdoor carrier or cage. Yes, with a recent wing feather trim. Yes, on a harness. And yes, I just hold them and trust they won't fly off. And no, I never take my bird outdoors. So it looks like so far the majority is yes, in an outdoor cage or carrier. And we have some harnesses and some wing feather trims. No one has replied that they just hold them and hope they trust they won't fly off. I guess that's a good sign. And no, I never take my bird outdoors at 24%. So give people a little bit more time. Can you see those results? Can you see those poll questions, Dr. Lamb?
I can see the poll questions, yeah, but I can't see the results so far.
Okay. Does any of that surprise you so far? Or is that on par what you experienced?
Yeah, pretty on par with what I see clients doing and reporting that they do.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I was curious to know about the harness training, because some birds, you know, you have one that's maybe an older bird, especially that's like, what in the world is this harness thing? Don't bring it near me. So,
yeah.
Okay, so far, let's give you another 30 seconds to answer these, to participate in the poll question if you're just joining us. So does your bird spend time outdoors? Yes, an outdoor cage or carrier is at 59%. Oh, 57% just went different. Yes, with the recent wing feather trim at 4%. Yes, on a harness at 4%. Yes, I just hold them and trust they won't fly off at 0%. And no, I never take my bird outdoors at 38%. So, all right. And I am going to end the poll. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and end poll. Okay, here are the results. Does your bird spend time outdoors at 54%? Yes, with a recent wing feather trim at 4%. Yes, on a harness at 4%. Yes, I just hold them and trust they won't fly off at 0%. And no, I never take my bird outdoors. Perfect. All right. Okay, so that is the end of the poll question. And now it looks like we're going to get this webinar started. If you're just joining us, thank you for being back with us on our webinar episode. My name is Laura Doering, and I'm your host today. Our special guest is Dr. Stephanie Lamb, and she is going to be talking about indoors or outdoors, what's best for your pet bird. We will do some Q&A questions at the end of the webinar. So in the meantime, if you can use the handy dandy Q&A button, not the chat button, but the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit your question. That way, if we don't get a chance to answer your question today, we will have your information so that we can email you a reply later. With that, Dr. Lamb, I'd like to let you take it away.
Hi, all right, thank you for having me back again. So yeah, this topic today of a bird going in, outdoors, getting some sunshine, I think it's a really important thing for owners to consider doing with their bird, but there's definitely pros, but there's definitely cons to taking your bird outside as well. And I hope, today we can talk about both the pros and cons, and people can then decide what's going to be right for them in their home and their individual unique situation. Because, we're all coming from different locations. Some of us are in cities, some of us are more in like suburban areas, and some of us are out in the country, you know? So different temperatures and environments and everything. So there's a lot that we have to take into consideration that our birds as individuals are going to be exposed to when they go outside. So there's definitely not a one size fits all answer for should I take my bird outside or not. So I hope after today's webinar with people who are watching this, they can get a little bit better idea of what's going to be right for them and their bird. So the first thing I wanted to go over really was what are the pros of a bird getting to go outside? And the definite benefits, number one is sunlight. Sunlight is really, really important for birds. Why is sunlight so important? Well, it's important because when birds are exposed to sunlight, that UVB radiation from sunlight actually allows them to make vitamin D. So when sunlight hits a bird's skin, it actually will convert cholesterols that are in the skin into this pre-vitamin D. And then that goes through some processing within the body to form active vitamin D. And then vitamin D is really important for lots of different things. The main thing that we know that vitamin D is helpful for with birds is their calcium. When a bird has appropriate levels of vitamin D, that vitamin D tells the intestines to start absorbing calcium effectively from the gastrointestinal tract. So the food that they're eating that has calcium in it, they're going to absorb that calcium a whole lot more effectively if they have appropriate levels of vitamin D. And exposure to sunlight allows them to make that vitamin D on their own. They make it and then they can absorb that calcium effectively, and then they use that calcium for various needs in their body. We all know that birds really need calcium to have normal reproductive cycling, which was something we had talked about a few weeks ago. It's important for those female birds who are laying eggs, because we know that eggshell is made out of calcium, but calcium is important for more than just reproductive cycling. It's important for normal bone health. It's important for normal nervous system health. It's important for normal muscle health. Normal muscle contractions are under the control partially of calcium. If you don't have appropriate calcium, then you can have muscle problems, nervous system problems, reproductive tract problems, weak bones where they're more prone to fractures and things like that. So it's something that, exposure to sunlight is going to allow you to make vitamin D, which is something that we really, really want. And there have been studies that have been done in parrots that have shown that when they're exposed to sunlight, they make vitamin D appropriately, calcium levels go up well. If birds are indoors, they can be exposed to UVB lighting, and that can be effective as well, but there's nothing like good old just natural sun, so there's that. That's really a huge benefit of birds going outside. And I think a lot of African gray parrot owners understand the importance of calcium. I think a lot of African gray parrot owners know that species of parrot in particular has been found to have more problems with low calcium levels, and so making sure that they get good calcium is really important, and so that sunlight exposure is going to be really helpful as part of that whole process. The other thing that's really good for birds when they're going outside, or the other big pro of going outside, is just mental enrichment. Just like with us, if we sit inside all day long and see the same things all day long, sometimes life gets a little bit boring. And I think people are understanding that a whole lot more right now, the last few months of people having to stay indoors because of COVID-19. And as different states are opening back up and people are allowed to go out and do things again, I mean, it seems like people are anxious to get out of their homes and do things. And so, think about our birds who may also be a little bit cooped up sometimes, and could really benefit from getting outdoors and seeing the world and seeing different things, even if it's just in the front yard or the backyard, to be watching just nature, watching other animals out in the wild, other birds in the wild, or squirrels, or what have you, you know, just to see other things and trees, and be around natural sounds and wind and all that stuff can be really good and mentally enriching for them. Another pro sometimes is exercise. You know, if you can get them outdoors and interacting with the environment a little bit more, then they may be a little bit more excited to explore new things outdoors, and could get more exercise that way. And then fresh air too, I think, is another pro that we could say. You know, being, again, cooped up indoors, sometimes air can seem just a little stagnant, and getting out and having fresh air can be really nice. So those are a lot of the pros of getting to go outside. Definitely, I think, really good for allowing a bird to thrive, you know.
And Dr. Lamb, I know that like my Amazon, for example, just loved the outdoor bath, you know, in the cage with the spray down. Just seemed to enjoy it like a different level when it was outside versus inside.
Yeah, yeah.
Seems to.
Yeah, it's interesting how sometimes we offer similar things indoors, and maybe they're not as excited, but getting them outside in a different environment just sort of stimulates something different for them to make them want to be excited and engaged more. So that is an interesting thing that you've noticed with your bird. So, but that being said, there's lots of pros, but there's also some cons that we have to take into consideration too. You know, the big thing is safety first, right? We have brought these birds into our lives. We are the stewards of their health and happiness, and we need to make sure that they are staying safe. So if we're getting them outside, I think one of the biggest things that should be pretty obvious that most people are thinking about is, are they going to fly away? If I take my bird outside, it has wings. In the wild, they're flying around outdoors, right? So is it going to just open up its wings and take off and fly away? So yes, that is a risk. If a bird is outdoors and there isn't some sort of restraint, training, cage, clipping, you know, then there is a risk that you could have a bird fly away. So there's things we can do about that, you know. Number one is you can just take them outside in a cage. And that was on the poll there. That sounds like it was what, I think 54% of people, that's how they get their bird outside is in a cage or carrier. And that's a perfectly acceptable way to do it. And if you're so lucky as to be able to have even something like an outdoor aviary, then that's really awesome, because then they can be in this really large environment, but still be closed in and be safe from flying away. So that would kind of be the ideal. Of course, not everybody has that ability to have an outdoor aviary. I would love one day to have an outdoor aviary, but I don't have an outdoor aviary. But maybe one day. But if you could have that, that would kind of be a real ideal situation to where you could safely take them outside. They're exposed to natural sunlight, the fresh air and everything, but they're still within an enclosed environment. Yeah, maybe they could even still fly around in that environment as well, but they're enclosed within it and safe. But if you don't have an aviary, a cage, you know, you can still take them out in a nice cage where they're, again, still getting all those benefits of the sunlight, the air, you know, and just mentally enriching them because they're getting to see what's going on. So those are perfectly acceptable. What's also really nice is having a harness. You know, if you can harness train your bird, get them used to wearing a harness and taking them out that way, that's a perfectly acceptable way to do it as well. Now, there's different types of harnesses that are out on the market. The best ones for parrots are going to be ones that are actually sort of covering the chest area. And that's sort of where they're restrained from, is from the body as opposed to on the legs. The reason the restraints on the legs, there could potentially be problems with those sort of restraints. I have seen people do those before and been okay, but the big restraint or big problem with when we restrain along the legs is the potential for, if they do get scared and they get flighted and they suddenly jump off of something, if they then get pulled back by the leash that they're on, you could potentially injure their legs. Versus if they're on a harness, then it's a whole lot less likely and unlikely for them to, if they jump and take off and they're on the harness, for them to be hurt when they kind of come to the end, because their whole body is more secure. You're unlikely to be fracturing limbs or that sort of thing. I have seen that unfortunately happen before with in times where people have just put restraints on the legs. But with harnesses, it's definitely something that you should harness train your bird, because we want to make going outside being a fun thing and an enjoyable thing. And if a bird is afraid of getting a harness placed on, then you know, they may not enjoy so much going outside, because if they're really afraid of a harness, and we hold them down and we strap them down in this harness and then we take them outside, then they could be just really anxious and nervous and scared and not really getting outside for the benefit of getting outside. And then the next time you try to do it again, we could potentially ramp up that anxiety level each time we're trying to take them outdoors, because they're afraid of a harness. So it's really important, if you are going to choose the route of doing a harness with your bird, that you work on harness training with them. Now, in a perfect world, you would harness train them when they're young, because it's easiest to do it when they are young. When they're young, they're just more accepting of new things, you know, and anybody who's had a baby bird, I think, can understand that when they are young little babies, they're more okay with whatever it is you want to do with them, versus when they're older, they're that sort of instinct of being cautious really kicks in, and they're a little bit more concerned about new things. So there are some really good resources online for people who want to harness train their birds. I know in particular, like Barbara Heidenreich has some stuff about harness training birds that she's written before, that I believe is on her website. But it's really sort of a step-by-step, slow, gradual process where you're teaching them that the harness is okay, and you're giving them positive reinforcement when you're working with them with the harness, so that it isn't this scary thing. It's something that can be enjoyable, and we pair it with getting to go outside. And a lot of birds, once they learn how to accept a harness, and they know that the harness means we're going outside, it's almost sometimes just like a dog. Like your dog sees you touch the leash and they just like flip out and they're so excited, and you know, it's the greatest day ever. The same thing can happen with birds too. They just have to learn that this is a safe thing, we're okay, and now we're gonna go have a lot of fun. So, and then the other way to be safe with taking a bird outside, if we don't have an aviary or cage or carrier or harness training, is clipping. Now there are pros and cons to clipping feathers, and there is definitely a huge caveat of, just because a bird's clipped does not mean it cannot fly away. So that's a really important thing that I need to say just right up front about clipping and taking your birds outside. Because yes, a wing trim is supposed to prevent a bird from flying. However, when a bird is appropriately trimmed with its flight feathers, there's the primary flight feathers and the secondary flight feathers. And most of the time, we're trimming the primary flight feathers. The primary flight feathers are the feathers that are important for like thrust. And so they're the feathers that are important for getting the bird up into the air. So we're clipping those particular feathers. So it's going to be hard for a bird to potentially get up into the air. But the secondary feathers, those are the feathers that are for lift. And so those are typically left in place. And it's important that they be left in place because those are sort of a safety net for birds. Because if we just cut all the primaries and secondaries, then the bird would not have any lift, it wouldn't have any thrust, and say it jumped off of something and it didn't have any ability to catch any air underneath itself, it could fall, it could jump off of something and land and hurt its keel, and then they're in the veterinary hospital. And I definitely see those sort of cases all the time with birds that have been clipped too severely. Keel trauma, tail trauma, fractures, all those sort of things can happen when a bird is clipped too severely. So that's why we don't clip them too severely, because we want them to be able to, if they do jump off something, land safely. However, because we're not clipping those feathers that help with lift, those secondary feathers, if a bird is outdoors and a gust of wind comes by and that bird puts out its feathers, then that could be enough lift that a bird could get from that gust of wind to take that bird up into the air. Now, depending upon the size of your bird and how much of the primary feathers are cut, you may not get too far, or you could potentially get pretty far away. I have certainly, sadly, heard of people who the bird wings were clipped, but it got just enough lift with a gust of wind coming by and the bird took off and they didn't get their bird back. Or the other thing I've had happen too is where people thought that the bird was clipped enough, never really sort of tested it to see what they could do in the house, or, you know, it was the bird had molted and they didn't realize that there were some new feathers in and just enough feathers for it to fly. They took the bird outdoors and the bird took off. So it's really important. Yeah.
Is there isn't necessarily a one size fits all with wing feather trims. What I mean by that is that if you brought in, like, say, 2 different species of birds on the same day for a wing feather trim, it doesn't mean like they're both gonna be unable to fly away for the same duration of time. Like, one might be able to get the wings to fly, you know, be able to get lift off to fly sooner than the other one, depending on the species. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, like, just as a general thing, like African grays, Amazons tend to need a little less feathers clipped to keep them grounded because they're just a little more heavy-bodied birds versus like conures. Conures, I mean, you tend to have to clip more with them to prevent them from getting up into the air because, man, they're small, they're very streamlined, and they don't need much as far as feathers go to get up into the air and take off. So they tend to need more wings clipped. Now, that's a generalization, but I have to even say, like, for example, with my own Amazon that I have, I do clip him occasionally, and I have to do more feathers on him than I do on a lot of other Amazons when I'm doing clipping. And I don't know why that is, but he is just really, he's a good flyer. So he doesn't need much to get up and go flying. So for him, I know personally I need to take more feathers than I would on another Amazon similar size. And that's just, he's just unique in that way. So
interesting. Yeah.
So there definitely is not a one size fits all for wing trims on birds. So yeah, that's definitely something that needs to be kept in mind too, that just because, you know, maybe you go get your bird's wing trimmed, you know, definitely if you're going to take them outside and that's what you're relying upon to keep them grounded and not being able to fly away, test it out indoors. Definitely test out indoors. And also don't take them out maybe when it's a windy day, you know. Just because, again, those gusts of air can get birds into the air and get them taken pretty far away. So, okay, so other cons to taking birds outside, aside from the fact of could they fly away, is the risks of predators. If you're taking your bird outside, it's really important to be with them. Now, if you have an outdoor aviary and the birds are maybe outdoors a little bit more permanently, then you need to really inspect your aviary and make sure that there are appropriate barriers to prevent any predators from coming in, breaking into the aviary, because, you know, some of our natural predators that we have out there are pretty smart. I have seen, as a veterinarian, some very unfortunate situations. I've had the typical domestic predators that people think about, cats and dogs, get birds. But then I've also had cases where it's a wild animal, raccoons, with their really dexterous little hands, and they're very, very smart animals, can easily reach into cages, and parrots have been grabbed before by raccoons and yanked over towards cages. So you just have to be mindful of that. Rats, they're small, they can get into little things. So making sure, if again you have like an outdoor aviary or a cage that a bird is in, making sure that the bars are small so nothing can get in. Coyotes, I'm out in Arizona, so I've had patients come in where I had one time a bobcat got somebody's bird.
Wow.
And that particular incident, the owner was sitting outside with the bird. They walked inside for just a second. They left the bird alone for just a second, and a bobcat grabbed their bird. They got their bird back. I mean, because they were only a moment away, they chased the bobcat down, and the bobcat ended up dropping the bird, and they got their bird back. So they were very, very lucky. The bird had just a little injury on it. Thankfully, it wasn't more severely injured than what it could have been. But the people didn't recognize that there was even a bobcat around their yard. But the bobcat was watching them and waiting for the owner to walk away for just a second. So predators are a very big problem. Definitely something that people have to keep in mind, that they are out there. If you have your bird outside, really best to be out there with them.
And Dr. Lamb, snakes as well. I've heard stories about snakes.
Yeah. Yeah, and they're small, right? They're small, and you don't always necessarily see where they're hiding. So you got to be cautious. And the other thing too is insects. Biting and stinging insects, they can be a problem too. I mean, even something as simple as an ant. For a little parrot, a small parrot outside. I mean, a little ant could do some pretty big damage. And then the other thing along those same lines is, like, when it comes to biting insects, stinging insects, that sort of stuff, some of those insects, like mosquitoes, can transmit disease, so that's something to keep in mind as well. When again, it depends upon where you live as to how much of a problem mosquitoes are for you. But if you are in an area where mosquitoes maybe have some seasonality, maybe during those seasons or times of day, when mosquitoes are out, they like to be, dawn and dusk, maybe not having the birds out during those particular times. Other thing that's really important or to consider as a potential con is temperature. If you're taking your bird outside, you need to make sure that the weather is appropriate. And this is also going to vary, of course, based upon where people live, because it's not just the temperature itself, but it's also the humidity that's really important to keep in mind. Generally speaking, people will say parrots can tolerate somewhere as low as 55, as high as about 80. But that does really, really depend also upon humidity levels, sunlight, shade, all that sort of stuff. So, for example, again, I'm in Arizona, and I'm in the Phoenix area, and it gets pretty hot here. But for me, what I think of as hot, I think is probably a little different than maybe what I used to think of as hot when I lived in Minnesota. Here, I think 95 is beautiful. And in fact, the other day it was 95 and I was outside with my bird. And we were fine. But if I would be out in Minnesota at 95, and all the humidity that's associated with 95-degree temperatures in Minnesota, that's a little bit more difficult to deal with. And I wouldn't take my bird out if it was high humidity and temperatures that high. That is uncomfortable. But here it's very dry. So because it's very dry and humidity is very low, those temperatures that an animal and human can withstand tend to be a little bit higher. The other thing though is, where are you sitting in relation to the sun? You know, are you just directly in the sun? If you're directly in the sun with your bird, they can heat up really easily. So it's important to make sure that they have access to shade. They can go into the shade if they want, they can go into the sun if they want. And then, you know, on the flip side of it being cool outside, you know, when people are taking their birds outdoors, not at maybe this time of year, but more in winter times, you know, if it's less than 55 degrees, you know, you have to be cautious. If you do have some outdoor aviary, because I know of people who have had outdoor aviaries with birds and in colder places, but they have shelter for their birds. You know, they have heat sources for the birds to go to. They have shelter from any wind, rain, anything like that. So to give an exact temperature range is a little difficult because it really depends upon lots of other factors. And so you really need to keep all those other factors in mind.
What about, I'm just thinking about summer barbecues and such. Just to keep in mind that if you have your bird outside an outdoor cage or something and you're barbecuing food, you know, the potential the bird's not getting toxins from the fumes of the
that's a very good point.
Or if you have a fire pit going, that kind of stuff that people might do during the summer.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. I didn't even think about that, but you are absolutely correct because, you know, it may be fun for us to sit by a fire pit or hang out by the grill, but there are fumes. Birds, we definitely recommend that they not be around any sort of fumes of any kind, smoke. Their respiratory tract is different than ours, and it's a lot more sensitive than our respiratory tract is. And there's certain toxins that can be airway toxins that can kill a bird. And so if there's any sort of smoke, fumes, if people are, I don't know, painting or anything like that, you know, you want to not have the birds necessarily be out around that stuff. Don't keep your birds near anything smoky or fume-like at all. So, the other thing that's a potential risk is theft. Sadly, that is something that happens. And in fact, I had a patient here who the owners let the birds out quite a bit outside, and one day they let the birds out, and one of the birds, they went back to go get them, and one of the birds was not around. One was missing of a group of two. And so, you know, they were frantic. They started looking around, but they couldn't find the bird. And it turned out somebody had stolen the bird. Thankfully, they got the bird back through social media. They, you know, put a call out saying, I've lost my bird, please help. They put a bunch of information up, and somebody was able to say, hey, I think I know who has your bird. And so they were able to get their bird back, but theft happens, you know, and, you know, we love our parrots and we think of them as family members. But I think sometimes people see them as these beautiful things that are maybe somebody would pay a lot of money for, you know, and I can't even really fathom that because again, to me, they're my family members, but that is something that sometimes people think, you know, and they may think that they can steal this bird and get money for it. So you have to, again, be watching where your birds are if they're outside, and best to be with them so that nothing happens. So, and then the other con I was going to say is infectious agents. So I kind of hit on it for just a second with like the biting and stinging insects, some of them being able to transmit infectious diseases. But there's more infectious diseases out there than just those things that mosquitoes could potentially transmit. With mosquitoes, we worry about things like West Nile virus, but there are other bacteria, viruses, parasitic problems that are out there. It's just part of nature. And, you know, if you have your bird in a location where wild birds are coming by, then there is going to be risk that a wild bird could potentially bring something in. There's chlamydia, influenzas, Newcastle disease virus, certain parasitic disorders. So those are things that we need to keep in mind too, and maybe best to, if you're taking your bird outdoors, have it be somewhere that wild birds are not frequently going, just so that you're really limiting your chances of there being a problem as far as infectious things go. And you know, if there is any concerns, then, you know, not taking them outside if you're seeing potentially dead birds around or birds that look sort of sick outside around, don't take your birds outside. So just being mindful of that sort of stuff. So, you know.
For you about the outside. So let's say that you keep an outside cage, like you have a cage that's out on your patio or your backyard. Should you hose it down before you put your bird in there in case, let's say, wild bird droppings or any kind of contaminant?
Yeah, that's perfectly acceptable. To hose it down, even use, you know, some sort of disinfectant, like, again, as we had talked, I think a little while ago, a few webinars ago about when we were talking about COVID, you can use bleach. It needs to be diluted. You can use that to clean down a cage, dilute it appropriately, dried, sprayed down, then a bird can go into that. But that is a acceptable thing to do.
Okay.
Yeah. So, not to, you know, I don't, of course, ever want to scare people into not taking their birds outside. It's just all the things that we need to think about, you know, when we're taking them outside, so that we can be as safe as possible. And then as long as we're being really safe, then we can have all those great benefits of all those pros: the sunlight, the environmental stimulation, exercise, fresh air, all that stuff. So.
Great. So do we have, let's see, are you ready for some questions? We've got some pretty interesting and very good ones from
certainly.
Okay. So Naima asks, what is a safe cage or crate to use? Need a folding one to put away in the wintertime. Do you know of any recommendations for them?
A safe crate.
A cage or crate, yeah, that would
cage or crate.
Fold away, yeah.
Okay, well, yeah, so, you know, I wish I knew some specific brand names, and unfortunately I'm not very good on specific brand names, but they do make fold away crates for dogs that can be really nice for the larger birds that can't, of course, get through the slats or anything like that, that you could potentially use to take a bird outside. Because if you're using sort of the carrier that, you know, like a pet carrier, you may not be getting enough sunlight through there. And right, one of the benefits is getting to just be out in the sun. We want to have a little bit more fresh air. We don't want them to be cooped up in one of those like plastic carriers where there's not a lot of airflow. It would be better to be one of those bigger carriers. And if you have like African gray sized bird or above, then some of those dog crates can work really nice, that are foldable and easy to store, and then you can take it out and just pop it up whenever you want to use it. Those can work just fine.
Okay. And that also, I imagine, you know, you get them used to going in that, and it makes it much more easy to transport them to the vet or wherever else they need to go. They're used to going into that kind of.
Exactly.
Okay, and so another question for you is, Charlie asks, do they need direct sun, or is outdoor shade acceptable?
Both are acceptable. Outdoor shade, you know, if it's like light that's sort of coming through, like a tree, like leaves and stuff like that, that's okay. You know, it's good for them to get some direct sunlight so that they really get the benefit of making good levels of vitamin D. But filtered light is appropriate, and by filtered, again, I mean like light coming through a tree or something like that. And if they're in a completely shaded area, that's fine too. They're not going to get so much of the benefits of the, you know, really heavy UV rays penetrating and allowing them to make vitamin D great, but you're going to have all those other benefits. And, you know, sometimes you may be taking them outside more in a shaded area if it's warm outside, and we need to keep them from getting overheated, of course. And we definitely want them to be in a nice shady area. So.
Okay, and then Chris asks, we only have 3 months warm enough up here. I often wonder, is my bird, um, uh, why only those times they go out, wait, I'm sorry. I often wonder, is my bird, why only those times they go out and ends up cruel to keep them in for 9 months due to the winters? Is it better perhaps to just keep them in? So,
You know, I think if you can take advantage of those 3 months, then that's fine. And I don't think that they necessarily would feel that it would be cruel during the 9 months that they're indoors. They probably would be happy to go outdoors when they can go outdoors and get all the mental stimulation and benefits of going outdoors. But they're probably not then during those 9 months when they're indoors being too upset by it. So I would still get them outside during those times if you can do it safely. And then, you know, if you're in an environment where it's pretty cool, you know, 9 months out of the year, then that's when exposing them to UVB lights indoors can be beneficial, because then they can get their sunlight from being indoors with those things.
okay. See, our next question is coming up shortly. Okay, Helen asks, what are your thoughts on UV lights for birds in the winter? Any particular model that you recommend? Light through a bright window still helpful? And any concerns about sunlight and cataracts?
Okay, great. So the perfect segue into this question. So yes, I do think, as I mentioned from answering the last question, that UV lights are helpful. The UV lights that are on the market, they do make a specific bird UV light. I believe it's called Avian. But there are reptile bulbs that also produce UVB, and that's kind of the products that were first on the market, because people who own reptiles know that they need to have UVB lighting for a lot of the species that are kept in captivity. And so you can actually use those bulbs as well. The UV spectrum that is appropriate for birds to be exposed to, that allows them to make vitamin D well, is between 280 and 320 nanometers. So what does that mean? I know that might sound a little like odd. Well, the way that what you would do is, when you get a UV bulb, if you go to the pet store and you get a UV bulb, look at the box. On the box, there is going to be a little graph. And this little graph shows you where UV emission is occurring. And on this little graph at the bottom, you're going to see all these little numbers. And there's going to be a little spike. And where that little spike should be, matching up with those numbers at the bottom of the graph, should be between 280 to 320 nanometers, where that little spike is. And that lets you know that that bulb is emitting the appropriate UVB radiation that the bird is going to need in order to make vitamin D on their own in their body. So I can tell you a couple of brands that I do know that have that appropriate emission. Is the Avian, and then there's Reptisun for the reptiles, but again, you can use them for birds. Reptisun 5.0, Reptisun 10.0, those are fine. Those emit UVB radiation in that appropriate spectrum. Preferably, those lights should be on for several hours a day when you're using them indoors. And they can potentially be dangerous, in that they can lead to burns. Just like if you're sitting out in the sun all day long and you can get a sunburn, same thing can happen if you're sitting under a UVB light all day long. You can get a sunburn. What I have seen is not so much cataracts, is more actual burns on the corneal surface. And that's what was in the studies that they have done with budgies, that they found is that sometimes they would get redness around the eyes, or even burns on the corneal surface, because they're basically like sitting underneath the sun. So they can't be too close to it, is what has come about from that research, is that if they sit too close to this light all day long, then you can get a burn. So the recommendation is that they shouldn't be any closer than 6 inches to the light. If they're closer than 6 inches to that light, then there's a greater chance that they could develop burns, and particularly burns along the corneal surface, on the eye itself, or any non-feathered parts of their body. But the further you get away from the light, the less that light is actually working, because those UVB rays from that light can only penetrate so far. So beyond 24 inches away from the bird, that UVB penetration may be very, very minimal. So generally speaking, we tell people, keep that light somewhere between further than 6 inches away, no further than 24 inches away, somewhere in that range away from the bird. Close to, you can keep it close to an area where maybe the bird goes to several times during the day, but not necessarily hangs out all day long. Like, don't put it right next to the favorite perch in the cage all day long, because that's when you're more likely to see birds occur. And I did see a patient one time, a cute little Gouldian finch, who had its favorite perch that it would sit on all the time, and the owner had put the lamp like right up above it. And unfortunately, he got little burns on the corneas. We took it away, backed it up, and then, treated his eyes, and everything was okay. He did fine. But that is a potential risk. So just remember that they can burn you just like the sun can burn you too. So
would you recommend that people only use those during daylight hours and not?
Yes, only during daylight hours. You don't want to use them at nighttime, because then it'd be like us being exposed to sunlight all the time. Like, it'd stress you out after a while.
Okay. Yeah, I figured as much. Lights on that night.
Yeah.
Daniela asks, what is a safe distance from the wild bird poop? For example, if there is a bird feeder nearby, that wild birds frequent, like what's a safe distance to keep your bird from there?
Okay, well, you certainly don't want them to be in contact with that feeder at all. So no direct contact. That's definitely a no. As far as how far away beyond that, probably a couple of feet away, just to make sure that there isn't anything like aerosolizing around there. Well, maybe a little bit more than a few feet away, because if they're passing something, some sort of infectious agent, for example, like chlamydia, is a infectious disease that we worry about, that can be transmitted in the feces. And if the feces dries and then crumbles and aerosolizes, then it could potentially transmit that way. And so several feet away from like a watering station, a bird feeder, or a common place that birds are hanging out, wild birds are hanging out, would be appropriate. We wouldn't want them closer than several feet, like 2-3 feet is what I would say.
Thanks. And Priscilla asks, I take mine out in their cages. I do have bird feeders and wild birds come and go. Since my parrots are in their cages and not in contact with the ground, I'm hoping the risk from wild birds is small. Does this seem okay?
Since the cages are not in contact with the ground, then you're going to have less of a chance of there being problems, because birds do like to come around on the ground, and they can forage through stuff on the ground and potentially pick up stuff from the ground inappropriately. So off of the ground, you're going to be safer, and then further away from the feeders and waters, again, it's going to be safer. Yeah.
Okay. Monica asks, are there any vitamin D supplements for indoor birds?
Well, so vitamin D can be supplemented orally, and it is in some foods and multivitamins and things like that. However, generally speaking, it's safer to use the UV lights for them to make vitamin D on their own, because the body will never make more vitamin D than it needs to. But you can supplement more vitamin D than you need to. And excessive amounts of vitamin D can be toxic. So it's safer to use the UVB lights so that they make their own vitamin D than necessarily giving them a vitamin D supplement, unless of course there's some health condition that your veterinarian is treating that would require them to be on that.
Are there any signs of vitamin D toxicity that would show in a bird that's been
so
vitamin D?
Yeah, so if they get too much vitamin D, orally supplemented, vitamin D, as far as what it can do toxic-wise, is it can cause, because it's allowing them to absorb a lot of calcium, it can cause mineralization of tissues. So calcium deposits in tissues. And in particular, the tissues that get most upset with that is the kidneys. So you can actually cause kidney damage to animals if they're getting too much vitamin D. And then what an owner might see of a bird at home who has kidney damage is excessive thirst, excessive urination, and then just not feeling well, you know, just feeling kind of general crummy, sick bird. So.
Okay. All right. Olivia asks, how much time parrot can be in an outside cage? How much, the maximum amount of time that you should aim for if your bird's going to be outside? What would that be?
Well, you know, I don't know that there's a great concrete answer to that because, you know, people who have outdoor aviaries, some people have their birds outdoors 100% of the time. As long as they have a safe environment, they can do fine outside 100% of the time. Safe environment, free of predators, secured kind of away from wildlife. They can go outside and do well. I would say more along the lines of minimum, what's minimally appropriate. If in an ideal world we were all able to get our birds outside safely, you know, even just like 30 minutes outside a day can be beneficial, getting sunlight exposure, because again, just a little bit of exposure to the sun has your body starting to make vitamin D. So yeah, it'd be nice if we could all get our birds out for a little bit during the day. You know, admittingly, we're all busy. I know I don't get my birds out every single day. I wish I could. Again, maybe one day.
All right. So Charlie asks, can they handle the higher temperatures if they spend time outside as it warms up or cools down? I live in Central Florida and have Quakers and eclectus.
Yeah, so that's a very good point that I forgot to hit on when we were talking about the temperatures. Yes, it's much better when an animal is gradually introduced to increasing temperatures and gradually introduced to decreasing temperatures. They're going to be able to adapt and handle it much better than if they suddenly go from one extreme to the next. So yes, they can adapt gradually with time to do safer that way.
And Nema asks, oh, thanks for the answer. Most crates are coated. Is that coated? Is coated safe?
It depends on, you know, how they're coated. The powder coating is okay. It's always good to, you know, when you purchase a crate, to find out what it's made of, you know, make sure that there isn't any soldering at the junctions between the bars, because there could potentially be like zinc soldering if there was that, if that was used, that could potentially be toxic. But the powder coating, that's meant to kind of keep it safer for the birds, actually. So that's okay. But okay. Important to check and make sure what your cage is made of. So.
Good to know. And then, so Helen asks, how many hours of sunlight is recommended?
How many hours of sunlight is recommended? You know, the studies, I guess, really haven't been done to say how much outdoor time they really need to get great long-term health. But the studies that have been done that looked at the UVB lights that we use indoors, they ultimately recommended that about like a minimum of 6 hours a day with those UVB lights is preferred. So sunlight, you know, the natural thing is a whole lot better than those UVB lights. You know, they're great and they work well, but sunlight is by and far better. So, you know, less time than that is fine. Again, even just 30 minutes exposure, you're going to be turning on those mechanisms to allow you to absorb vitamin D or make vitamin D appropriately in the body. So, you know, it's something that I would say a minimum probably 30 minutes outside if possible, but maximum, you know, again, the studies haven't been done to say for certain.
Okay. So, and then Monica asks, is it possible for a bird not to like UV light? I tried it once for my cockatiel, but he didn't seem to like the light. He seemed freaked out every time I turned the UV light on.
Oh, poor little guy. Well, you know, I guess it's possible. So here's something that's interesting that makes me think, I wonder if that's what's going on, is there's something called flicker fusion frequency. So when we're looking at a screen, a light of any source, lights do flicker. And for something to look very smooth and normal, the flicker fusion frequency has to kind of match with what our retina sort of interprets and makes our mind make sense. Hopefully I'm making this make sense. But birds, their flicker fusion frequency is different than ours. So what we see as this nice solid normal light, where I don't see any flickering in the light that's above my head right now, mm-hmm. To me, it looks like the light's just constantly on. There is a little flickering that's going on. Birds, because their flicker fusion frequency with what their retina understands and interprets in their brain is different than ours, they will actually see some flickering in lights that we don't see. And so I wonder if maybe that UV light that the owner was using, maybe that's what the bird was seeing differently and interpreting. Hard for me to say for certain, but that's what I'm suspecting maybe would be why that bird was a little afraid of it. When you look at those UV lights, they actually, you can tell that there's a difference with a UV light than like a standard bulb. Like there's a different glow to them, and birds can certainly see a whole lot more than what we can see. You know, they can see in that UV range. So maybe it was, you know, where we just see it as this white light, but the glow is a little different. Maybe that bird's seeing something that we can't even interpret or even understand because we can't see in the UV range, but he can, and he's seeing that, and it made him a little nervous. So maybe if she wants to try again, maybe start with the light like far away and just have it on for several hours, but it's like at the other end of the room, so he can like look at it from afar and inspect it and recognize that it's okay and it's not going to hurt him, and then can get closer and maybe he'll be a little bit more accepting of it.
Okay, yeah, good point. A little conditioning there that you needed. Lisa Bono, one of our contributors for Lafeber.com, she commented that Preview Hendrix makes a folding carrier.
Okay.
So that might be something for people to check out if you need to store things to use as needed. I think, let's see if I think we're all done with our questions today. That was awesome. Super awesome. Anything else to add? I know this is just such a great topic, especially, I mean, this time of year, everyone, it's a really good time of year to sunshine and stuff to maybe think about those baby steps, at least of introducing your bird to some outdoor time safely and responsibly.
Yeah, no, I don't have anything else really to add other than, it's different for every owner. And I'll tell you, I even do different things with my own birds where certain individuals, I feel more comfortable with them. And other individuals that, like, I have one of my birds that I don't want a clipper, so if she's coming outside, she's definitely coming in a carrier. What works well for one bird may not work for all birds, and we just have to figure out what works best for our individual birds and our individual homes. So
okay. Oh, sorry, that just sparked a question for me. I thought I had it. So if you have multiple birds, do you think that bring them all out together might make them feel more comfortable because they feel like they're in part of a flock as opposed to not individually?
Yeah, I do, because I'll take a couple of my birds out at a time. I do think they're a little bit more comfortable when they are multiple individuals together, because then it's more like we're a flock right now, and safety in numbers.
Okay, yeah. Plus, then you're not rotating all these birds, for like 3 hours. More random, probably too, if you can do that.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, that was very enlightening. Thank you. We totally appreciate you being on with us today, and I'm sure we will see you back very soon. I think we'll probably see you on a webinar in July. So stay tuned for that. We'll have Dr. Lamb back with us on another great topic. And next Friday, we will have Dr. Tom Tolley with us for another session of Ask the Vet. So if you have a vet question, next Friday, tune in at 12, same time, same place, 12 o'clock next Friday.
All right. Bye.
That is all for today then, I guess. Big thank you. Have a wonderful day. A wonderful weekend. Till next time, stay safe, and all the best to you and your flock. Bye.
Bye.